are nights in the emergency room that change you forever. Nights when everything you thought you knew about your job, about protocols, about what's right and wrong, gets tested in ways you never imagined. My name is Helena Grant, and I've been an ER nurse for 12 years at Memorial Hospital in Seattle. I've seen gunshot wounds, overdoses, car accidents that defy imagination, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the night a man without a pulse for 5 minutes arrived with a code tattooed on his wrist that would put me in the middle of a classified military operation. This is my story, and I need to tell it because what happened that night still haunts me, still makes me question every decision I made. What would you have done? Would you have followed the rules, or would you have trusted your instinct when everything around you screamed danger? It was 2:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in March when the paramedics burst through the doors with him. I remember because I had just finished dealing with a drunk driver who wouldn't stop screaming, and I was exhausted, running on my 4th cup of coffee. The lead paramedic, Marcus, someone I'd worked with for years, had this look on his face I'd never seen before, pure terror mixed with confusion. He shouted that they had a male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, no identification, no wallet, no phone, found collapsed in an alley downtown, no pulse for 5 minutes. They'd been doing CPR the entire transport. My training kicked in immediately. We got him onto the gurney, and I started taking over compressions while Dr. Reeves prepared for intubation. The man was covered in dirt, his clothes were torn, and that's when I first noticed them, the tattoos. Not regular tattoos. These were military insignias, coordinates, symbols I recognized from my brother's time in the Marines. But there was something else. On his left wrist, partially hidden under the grime and blood, I saw numbers, a sequence that looked deliberate, methodical. 047923 Alpha 6. It wasn't a birth date. It wasn't a phone number. It was something else entirely. And in that moment, while I was fighting to bring this man back to life, something in my gut told me this wasn't just another overdose or random assault victim. If this story has already hooked you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. Comment below where you're watching from. I want to know who's following this journey with me. Amor Fuyant, we got him back. After 8 minutes of aggressive CPR, 2 rounds of epinephrine, and 1 shock from the defibrillator, his heart started beating again. The entire team erupted in relieved cheers, but I couldn't celebrate. Something felt wrong. Dr. Reeves ordered a full workup: toxicology, CT scan, blood work, the standard protocol for John Doe's in critical condition. But as we were cleaning him up to move him to intensive care, I got a closer look at those tattoos. They weren't amateur ink. These were professional, precise, the kind that special operations soldiers get. I'd seen them before on my brother's friends, coordinates that probably marked mission locations, unit insignias, and that code on his wrist. Now that I could see it clearly under the fluorescent lights, it had a small symbol next to it, an eagle with spread wings clutching arrows. I knew that symbol. It was associated with classified military units. My hands started shaking as I documented his injuries. This man was not supposed to be here. Everything about him screamed official, government, classified, and the fact that he had no identification, no belongings, nothing that could tell us who he was, made it even more suspicious. I should have reported it immediately to hospital administration. That's the protocol. But something made me hesitate. What if reporting it put him in more danger? What if whoever left him in that alley wanted him dead? Thank you for staying with me this far. It shows that you feel the same thing I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes now changes everything. By 4 in the morning, our John Doe was stabilized but still in a coma. I was finishing my documentation when I made a decision that could have cost me my nursing license. I took a photo of that code on his wrist with my phone. I told myself it was for medical records, but I knew I was lying. I was curious. I was scared. I needed to know who this man was. During my break, I went to the staff lounge and did something I never thought I'd do. I searched that code online. Nothing came up in regular searches. Then I tried military forums, veteran websites, anywhere that might give me a clue. Finally, on an obscure forum for former special operations members, I found a thread discussing identification protocols for classified missions. The codes, someone explained, were emergency identifiers used by operatives in deep cover situations. If they were compromised, injured, or captured, these codes could be used to verify their identity and trigger extraction protocols. My blood ran cold. This man lying in our intensive care unit wasn't just former military. He was active. He was on a mission, and something had gone terribly wrong. I sat there in that empty lounge, my coffee getting cold, realizing I was holding information that was probably classified at the highest levels. What was I supposed to do? Who could I even tell? If I went to hospital administration, they'd call the police. If the police got involved, it could compromise whatever operation this man was part of. But if I stayed silent, was I breaking laws? Was I putting the hospital at risk? Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments. It's amazing to see people from so many places following stories like this. I didn't have to wait long for my answer. At 6:30 in the morning, just as the day shift was arriving and I was preparing to hand off my patients, 3 men in dark suits walked into the emergency department. They didn't check in at the front desk. They didn't speak to the triage nurse. They walked straight to the administrative offices like they owned the place. Within 10 minutes, our hospital director, Mr. Patterson, came down personally, something that never happened during night shifts. He looked pale, nervous, and he asked to speak with me immediately. My heart was pounding as I followed him to a private conference room. The 3 men were already there, sitting with folders in front of them, their faces expressionless. One of them, the oldest with gray hair and cold blue eyes, introduced himself only as Agent Morrison. He asked me, very calmly, to describe everything I'd observed about the patient in room 4 of the ICU. Every detail, every tattoo, every marking. I felt trapped. I'm a nurse. I take patient confidentiality seriously, but these weren't regular visitors, and I knew that refusing to cooperate could have serious consequences. So I told them everything I'd seen. The tattoos, the coordinates, the symbols. I didn't mention the code on his wrist. I don't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was rebellion. Maybe I just wanted to keep one card in my hand. Agent Morrison listened without interrupting, taking notes. Then he said something that made my blood freeze. This patient is now under federal protection. No one enters that room without our clearance. No medical records leave this building. And Nurse Grant, you never saw this man. Do you understand? The next 72 hours were surreal. The ICU became a fortress. 2 agents stationed outside room 4 at all times. No visitors allowed. Even Dr. Reeves had to get clearance every time he needed to check on the patient. The hospital staff was buzzing with rumors. Some said he was a terrorist. Others said he was a witness in a major case. I said nothing, but I couldn't stop thinking about that code. On my day off, I did something reckless. My younger brother, Danny, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines before getting out and becoming a contractor. He still had connections, people who knew people in the special operations community. I called him and, trying to sound casual, asked if he'd ever heard of emergency identification codes used by classified units. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Danny said, very carefully, Helena, why are you asking me this? I told him I'd treated a patient and seen something unusual, nothing more. Another long pause. Then he said, if you saw what I think you saw, you need to forget about it immediately. Those codes are used by operators in NOC situations, non-official cover. If someone has that tattooed on them and they end up in a hospital, it means their mission went sideways and they're in serious danger. The kind of danger that doesn't just affect them, it affects everyone around them. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. Danny continued, there's a database, highly classified, that tracks these operators. If the code gets flagged, it triggers protocols. Extraction, protection, sometimes elimination of threats. Helena, if you're involved in this, you need to be very careful. These aren't regular military. These are ghosts. When I returned to work 2 days later, the atmosphere had shifted. The agents were still there, but now there were more of them. The entire 4th floor of the ICU had been quietly cordoned off. I was assigned to different patients, kept away from room 4, but I couldn't let it go. During a shift change, I managed to slip past the nurse's station and get close enough to see inside the room through the window. He was awake. The man we'd brought back from death was sitting up slightly, talking to one of the agents. Even from a distance, I could see the intensity in his eyes. He looked alert, focused, like someone whose mind had never stopped working even while his body was in a coma. I shouldn't have stopped. I should have kept walking. But our eyes met through that window, and something passed between us. Recognition, gratitude, warning, I couldn't tell. But he saw me, and he knew I was the nurse who'd been there that night. An hour later, I was called into the supervisor's office. Agent Morrison was there again, and this time he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He asked me directly if I'd researched anything about the patient, if I'd discussed the case with anyone outside the hospital, if I'd taken any photos or made any copies of medical records. I lied. I told him no, that I understood the sensitivity and had followed all protocols. He studied my face for what felt like an eternity, then nodded slowly. Good, because if any information about this patient leaks, there will be consequences, not just for you, but for everyone involved. This is a matter of national security. As I left that office, my legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down in the hallway. I'd just lied to a federal agent. I'd taken a photo of classified information, and I had no idea what to do next. Everything changed on a Friday night, 3 weeks after that initial night. I was working the late shift again when I got an urgent page. Patient in room 4 needed immediate assistance. When I arrived, breathless, the agents at the door let me in without question. Inside, the man was having what looked like a panic attack, his vitals spiking dangerously. Dr. Reeves was on his way, but I was there first. I approached the bed, trying to calm him, checking his oxygen levels when he grabbed my wrist. Hard. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that was almost frightening, and he whispered so quietly that only I could hear, "You saw it. The code. I know you did." My heart stopped. I tried to pull away, but his grip was firm. He continued, his voice urgent and desperate. "They don't know about Nightingale. The coordinates are 37.895 north, 122.274 west. Tell Carson. Only Carson. His family is still there and they're running out of time." Before I could respond, before I could even process what he'd just said, Dr. Reeves burst into the room with 2 agents right behind him. The man released my wrist immediately, falling back onto the pillow, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion. Dr. Reeves administered a sedative while I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. He'd just given me coordinates, a name, information that was clearly classified, clearly dangerous, and he'd trusted me with it because I'd seen that code, because somehow, in that chaotic night 3 weeks ago, I'd become part of something much bigger than a medical emergency. The agents ushered me out of the room quickly, but the damage was done. I had information now. Information that apparently involved someone's family in danger, and I had absolutely no idea what to do with it. I spent the rest of that shift in a daze, going through the motions of patient care while my mind spun in circles. Who was Carson? What was Nightingale? And those coordinates, where did they point to? I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. During my break, locked in a bathroom stall, I took out my phone and carefully typed the coordinates into a mapping application. They pointed to a remote area in the Cascade Mountains, about 90 miles northeast of Seattle. Dense forest, barely any roads, the kind of place where you could hide anything or anyone. I stared at that map until my eyes blurred. Somewhere in those mountains, according to a man who'd been dead for 5 minutes and had classified military codes tattooed on his skin, someone's family was in danger. Someone named Carson's family, and apparently, they were running out of time. Every instinct I had as a nurse, as a human being, screamed at me to do something. But what? I couldn't go to the agents. They'd made it clear that any involvement beyond my medical duties was forbidden. I couldn't go to the police. This was clearly federal jurisdiction. I couldn't even talk to Danny about it without potentially putting him at risk. So I made a decision that still keeps me awake at night. I wrote everything down. The coordinates, the name Carson, the word Nightingale, the date and time the patient had given me this information. I sealed it in an envelope and hid it in my locker. Then I started researching. Not on the hospital computers, that would be tracked, but at home, on my personal laptop, using every search engine and database I could access. I needed to find out who Carson was, and why a dying operative would use his last moments of lucidity to get a message to this person. It took me 4 days of obsessive searching, barely sleeping, to piece together what I thought was happening. I found news articles about a special forces operator named Michael Carson, who'd been reported killed in action 18 months earlier, during a classified operation in Eastern Europe. His wife, Elizabeth Carson, and their 2 children had moved to Washington State shortly after, trying to start over. But here's what made my blood run cold. 6 weeks ago, Elizabeth Carson and her children had gone missing. The official story was that she'd taken the kids and left suddenly, possibly suffering from grief-induced breakdown. But there was no investigation, no Amber Alert, nothing that would normally happen when a mother and 2 kids vanish. It was like everyone just accepted the story and moved on. Except someone hadn't moved on. The man in room 4, whoever he really was, knew where they were. Those coordinates pointed to where they were being held, and he'd trusted me to get that information to someone who could do something about it. But who? Carson was supposedly dead. Then I found it. A single mention in a veterans forum, a comment from someone using the handle Nightingale 6, talking about operators who'd been burned, left behind, or presumed dead, but were actually in deep cover. And in that thread, someone mentioned that if you needed to reach out to one of these ghosts, you went through specific channels, unofficial networks that existed outside the government systems. I was in way over my head. I knew that. But I also knew that if I did nothing, a woman and 2 children might die, and I'd have to live with that for the rest of my life. So I made the hardest decision of my nursing career. I reached out to one of those networks. I won't go into details about how I got the message through. It's better for everyone if those specifics stay buried. What I can tell you is that 72 hours after I sent that information through the right channels, the patient in room 4 was transferred out of our hospital in the middle of the night. No paperwork, no official discharge, just gone. The agents disappeared with him. Hospital administration was furious but powerless, and I was left wondering if I'd done the right thing, or if I'd just committed career suicide. For 3 weeks, I heard nothing. I went to work, took care of patients, lived in constant fear that federal agents would show up to arrest me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat, imagining all the ways this could destroy my life. Then one morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox at home. No return address, no stamp, just my name written in neat block letters. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 lines typed on it. Elizabeth and her children are safe. Michael Carson thanks you for keeping the faith. The code you saw saved 17 lives. Not just one. You made the right choice. Destroy this letter. I stood there in my driveway, reading those words over and over until they blurred with my tears. 17 lives. I'd helped save 17 lives by trusting my instinct instead of just following protocols. I never saw that patient again. I never learned his real name or what operation he'd been part of, but I know that code on his wrist, the one I almost missed in the chaos of trying to save his life, was the key to something much bigger than I could have imagined. So what would you have done in my place? Would you have followed only the protocols, or would you have trusted your instinct? Leave your opinion in the comments. I read all of them, and love knowing what you think about these real-life stories. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next nursing stories that will leave you speechless. And go ahead and watch the next recommended video. There's another story you need to know.